Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special one-off podcast from Compassion in Politics, looking at the nature of compassion, how we cultivate it, and what it can do. I'm Jennifer Nadel, and my co-host is
Matt Hawkins, and for this special edition of the Compassion in Politics podcast, we are delighted to be joined by Professor Paul Gilbert. Paul is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Derby, and he has been a pioneer of the research into compassion-focused therapy and to compassion as a value. He is also the founder of the Compassionate Mind Foundation. Paul, to kick us off, tell us, what is compassion and what's its evolutionary story?
Okay, Matt, well, thank you for inviting me for this podcast. That's great. So compassion really has come from the evolution of caring motivation. Now, this is important because we know that, 500 million years or longer, animals began to care for their offspring. And when they did that, we saw changes in the way the body works and certainly changes in the brain. And over evolutionary time, humans, well, primates and certainly humans, have a whole range of physiological systems that allow them to be very sensitive to the suffering and needs of another, particularly one's offspring, obviously, and then to work out what to do to address that suffering and address those needs. So we see this in many, many animal species, don't we, where parents are very protective of their infants and so on and so on. But we also have a major physiological set of pathways in the brain and body that will facilitate that process. So we know then that compassion is rooted in a very important motivational system that affects how our brains and our bodies work. And we can define it, therefore, quite simply as being sensitive to suffering in self and others, having this attentional awareness as opposed to turning off from it or denying it or dissociating or turning away, with the second aspect, which is the preparedness to work out a wise way of acting. And of course, this can be a very courageous activity. For example, the people who are now working in the COVID wards to save others, some of them are risking their lives. So this is being sensitive to suffering, but also with a courageous orientation to engage with helpful behavior. But if it's not backed up with a preparedness to find out how to be helpful, and that is often a problem for people who just want to rush in and be rescuers or whatever. They get overwhelmed by intention, and whereas actually what they need is more wisdom, then you run into trouble. I mean, as you know, we say this all the time. If I see somebody fall into a fast-flowing river and I think, I must save them, so I jump in, but I can't swim, I just get washed away as well. So this wisdom aspect, this preparedness to work out what is the most helpful thing to do and to sometimes recognize that we don't know, that is a compassionate position, the recognition that we actually don't know what the best thing to do is. And I think that's a very important point when we come to think about compassion in politics, that there is not necessarily ready-made compassionate solutions on the shelf waiting for us to take them down. We're going to have to think quite carefully about what compassionate solutions are to political problems.
Thanks, Paul. Thinking now about acting on compassion or acting with compassion, what do we know are the key ingredients that make someone more or less likely to express compassion?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think the key thing is that humans are what we call multi-minded, right? We have lots of different kinds of motivational systems, which are almost separate little systems in the mind, and you can switch them on and switch them off. Now, we know, tragically, that not only are humans potentially one of the most compassionate species, I mean, we've got rid of smallpox and so on and so on, but we're also one of the most nasty species. I mean, our history is pretty terrible, whether you think about the Holocaust or the Roman Games or the awful tortures or the way women have been treated over the centuries or slavery. I mean, you can just go on and on. So one of the problems with compassion is naivety. That people think, compassion is a bit nice, but this, but that. that's a problem, because compassion is, you can't be naive. The reason we need compassion is because humans can be really, really nasty. They can be vicious, they can be incredibly dangerous, and tragically we see this all over the world now in many spots where wars are going on and so on. So the first thing about compassion, really, and compassion in politics is extremely important, is don't be naive about humanity. Humans can get up to some very nasty stuff indeed. And also humans can be very self-focused. And one of the issues with compassion is how in politics we break through into the self-focused, competitive, me-first orientation, which has largely crept into the world with the rise of neoliberalism. So that's one of the key things, is don't be naive about the human mind, and don't be naive about the challenges that compassion has in terms of addressing some of the dark side of the human mind, be it, self-focused, competitiveness, selfishness, or whatever it is.
When have you seen politicians acting compassionately?
Now, what's interesting, I think, is that after the war in 1945, there was a political agreement that we had to rebuild our societies, we had to rebuild Europe. So there was the arrangements with Germany and so on and so on. And in our country, all the politicians were agreed that we had to rebuild the country. So within 15 years, we had no money. We'd been smashed to pieces. We owed the Americans a lot of money. We built a health service. We built a railway service. We built education. We built new universities. Within 15 years, we had one of the health services that were the envy of the world. How do we do that? Political will. Political will did that. And that's a really important lesson for us to learn in going forward. Political will for a compassionate, rebuilt society will move us forward. But if we decide we want to go back to a neoliberal, competitive, deregulated society, then we're only going to go back to where we came from, which is starving the health services of the money that they need, starving social services of the money they need in order to provide tax cuts. That is the issue, that in politics, it's coming to decide that actually we need a politics like post-1945, which is rebuilding communities and rebuilding the world and creating a world where we cooperate now on all of the key issues that face us.
And of course, we have this moment where life as we know it has stopped because of the corona pandemic.
Yeah.
So how hopeful are you that out of this moment, a new consensus, a softer consensus? We've obviously seen that those we've often dismissed as not having value are the very people that we've most needed during this crisis. How hopeful are you that there may be a new consensus emerging?
Well, I think, just to be honest, simply, organizations like you, the fact that organizations like you have come to existence, the idea that compassion in politics is a very, very powerful and important idea, particularly when you understand that compassion is this deeply rooted motivational system that actually changes the way our brains work, changes the way our social relationships work. This is not some floozy, let's be nice to each other, let's be kind. It's not that. Compassion has this dedication, this courage to address the dark side of who we are, and a dedication to create a world that is more just and create a world that provides the things that the society needs, such as a health service, such as social care, and so on, good education services, all that stuff. So that is what gives me a lot of hope, is because, organizations like Compassion in Politics, and there are other politicians as well, who recognize that compassion is a source of strength, it's a source of courage, it's a source of wisdom. And the more we get that clear, that it is not some sort of let's just all be kind to each other, it's a dedication to the betterment of humanity, really.
You mentioned there, Paul, about how compassion can change the way that our brains work. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I think it's a great point, actually, because one of the things, as you and I have talked about here, is that it does change your brain. There are parts of your frontal cortex, there are parts of your autonomic nervous system called the vagus nerve, which are all affected by compassion and are rather turned off by stress. So one of the problems that politics has got, actually, and you saw this very much in the Blair years, is that it's a very competitive, you look at how people are with each other, and and there's often quite a lot of tensions and arguing. What you really need in politics is to create a safe space where people feel reasonably able to explore, discuss, and develop. So they're not constantly on the back foot trying to prevent, the Daily Mail or whoever it is having the swipes at them. So how do we create an environment where our politicians are not under such heavy pressures, stress, such that their capacity for thinking compassionately is limited? Because if you're in a very high threat environment, this knocks out your vagus. It's not good for compassionate thinking, really. So we need to think about how we create a way of doing politics, which isn't just based on trying to prove the other person wrong, but is based upon having a shared vision of the kind of world we want to live in. Now, to some extent, as I say, post-45, there was that. But we've got to get back to that, a shared vision of the basics of what we're all trying to make happen in our society, such as basic services and so on and so on.
What do you think allowed a more compassionate society to emerge in 1945?
I think there was a general agreement that we'd all been through some pretty bad traumas, and there was this real desire to build a new world, right? And that was very much led by, Bevan and a whole lot of other politicians that were very keen on this, rebuilding our communities and so on and so on. That's what I haven't seen yet in our political discussions. I mean, there's still virus fighting, so that's kind of understandable, but at some point, to see a politician start to talk about the fact that we need to rebuild our communities, we need to rebuild our health services, we need to rebuild our social care, we need to rebuild our jobs and economies and so on and so on. So how are we going to do that? And bringing people to really start thinking about the future, because at the moment we're just thinking about the next coming out of lockdown, the next couple of weeks. But we need to think about and start having visions about how do we want to come out of this? What do we want to create over the next 5 years?
And when you think about those huge challenges that we have as a society, one of the things we often find when we talk about compassion in politics is people saying, well, that's all very well, but we've got really difficult challenges to meet, as if compassion is sort of an optional extra or something that isn't really able to deliver the kind of courageous vision and decisiveness that people feel is needed at a time of crisis.
I think that's a brilliant point, Jennifer. And that is a problem because most people don't really understand what compassion is. It's just a word that sort of floats around in the ether. And there's a lot of stuff on the internet which is not helpful. That is, compassion is about let's be kind. Kindness is very different to compassion. I mean, if I remember your birthday and send you flowers, you'd say, oh, that's kind. I fancy for remembering my birthday. If I donate you a kidney, however, because you're dying, you wouldn't call that kindness. That's called a compassionate act. I'm not religious, but if you think about the way we talk about Christ, we talk about the compassion of Christ. We don't talk about the kindness of Christ, because compassion involves this dedication to address suffering. And that requires a certain kind of courage and sacrifice. Part of the Christian story is the sacrifice of Christ. So that altruistic aspect, that in compassion, there is a courageous wisdom, but there's also preparedness to sacrifice for the benefit of others. Now, if you don't get that, if you really don't understand what compassion is about, then it becomes problematic. Because as I say, people don't realize that it is absolutely the most important motivation of all of our motivations. Care and compassion is the most important, it's the most courageous, and it's the most wise.
And what about the role of language in terms of stimulating either positive or negative responses?
Yes, I think one of my favorite topics, as you know. I think that's right as well, right? So, I've been very concerned about some of the use of language which has been specifically designed to stimulate threat, anxiety, and fear. Okay, now, whether that was the right thing to do or not the right thing to do, that's not my call. But certainly it's left us with a lot of very frightened people out there who are frightened to come back as lockdown comes out. And I also think things like as you know, things like saving the NHS and so forth. I mean, this is just nonsense. The Daily Mail, not my favorite paper, but the Daily Mail today points out that, 2.4 million people are caught up in a cancer backlog. We know that over the next 6 months or a year, many people are going to die that didn't need to die because of decimation to all other services apart from the coronavirus service. The coronavirus service has expanded enormously, but it's squashed out and it's destroyed all the other medical services that people so rely on. There are people waiting for cancer treatments and operations, and people having strokes and all that. So that's gradually emerging now in the media. So don't use language like we're saving the NHS, because you're not saving the NHS. The NHS is being destroyed. Now, I'm not blaming anybody for that. It's just a fact. It's not to blame anybody, but don't peddle illusions. And when we talk about the virus, let's talk about how we can have an experience of safeness. Let's, focus on the fact that if I get the virus, there are people now who know an awful lot about how to treat that virus. So let's focus on our sense of safeness in our communities, the helpfulness of others, rather than just the personal fear. So how we use language to simulate a sense of safeness and confidence, or how we use language to stimulate fear. And also, the other thing that slightly worries me is starting to see setting people against each other. Those who are in favor of lockdown, those who are in favor of coming out of lockdown, COVIDiots, all these sort of phrases. And now you're beginning to see these kind of fractions where different parts of the community are kind of having different views of themselves. That worries me slightly, because it's quite easy to get groups to, the Brexit thing, it's quite easy to get groups to start, people forming subgroups against each other. And that's a worry. That's going to have to be managed, I think.
On a related note, Paul, you have said previously how you believe our economic system now, which is built on an emphasis on individualism, is very bad for our mental health. Can you tell us a little bit more about why that's the case?
Yes, it's a great point, Matt, because I think the point is that humans are very sensitive to cultural and social conditions. This is why, tragically, it's quite easy to get humans to do very bad things. We're always shocked by it, but actually, time and time again, whether you think of the Nazis, whether you think of Rwanda, whether you think of Syria, whether you think of Bosnia, I mean, people can be easily turned to do bad things. So we need to understand that people can be easily turned to be very self-focused, okay, to worry about themselves and their families and not worried about too much of anybody else. So we know that. So what happened, I think, was from about 1970s onward, there was a gradual movement, and the unions played their part in this, I have to say, of everybody wanting a bigger slice of the cake. So there was this idea, okay, so we build our communities now and we're starting to flourish, so we all now want a bigger slice of the cake. So what happened was, taxes started to come down and we started to focus on individual achievements. And then into the 80s came Margaret Thatcher, where there's, her view is no such thing as a society, only individuals. So we then got caught up on both sides of the Atlantic with this neoliberal, why worry about other people? Why not just focus on yourself? Your responsibility is to do the best you can for yourself and your family. You don't need to worry about anybody else. And that basic view is a psychology that fits very well with the human mind. We do have, just like we have a compassion motivational system, we do have a motivational system to get the best out of things. And that just makes a lot of sense, really, doesn't it? People, if your child has got a brain tumor, you want the best doctors, not the average doctors. We always want the best, we'd like to live in the best houses we can or have the nicest holidays. That just makes sense. But if you overstimulate that, then you end up with where we are, where it just becomes a bit of a free-for-all, which it has. And so the rich get very rich, and the rest of us sort of struggle along a little bit. So it's really bringing back to understanding how we have a political discussion around what our responsibilities are as a society to the less able. And I think that's where compassion in politics comes in, because compassion in politics reminds us that it's not just about facilitating production. I mean, I do agree with the idea that you have to create wealth before you can distribute it, but it is also about recognizing that the compassionate politics position is that you also have to create a social justice with the distribution of the resources that societies are generating. You have to have a system that will create a fair distribution, because if you don't, humans naturally gravitate to doing the best for themselves and their families. They will. That's just normal. That's natural. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you just let it go unabated, then you end up where you are now, where it becomes a free-for-all, really. And everybody wants to opt out. People don't want to pay their taxes. They always try to drive taxes down rather than make sure that taxes are spelt wisely. That should be what we should be about, not whether we pay tax or not, but making decisions about how we should be using revenues. So, I mean, when Theresa May came in, one of the first things she said was she's going to spend 40 billion on Trident. Well, hang on a minute. Our health service have been decimated by austerity, and you're talking about 40 billion on Trident. See, that's the kind of thing that compassionate politics can go after, I think. I'm actually saying those should never be priorities. Priorities should always be, how can we use the products of our labor fairly, wisely, to ensure that we build a society and a community and a nation which actually does look after the less able, that does look after people when they're sick, that does look after people when they're old. That's the great aspect of compassionate politics, is holding people's noses to that grindstone.
Paul, just in closing, if there was one change you could make, if you had a magic wand and there was one thing you could do to make society or politics more compassionate, what would it be?
That's a great question. I think really having much more agreement of thinking about how can we work more cooperatively. I mean, I know that politics do work cooperatively in the select committees and all of that sort of stuff, but I think that's a key thing. And one of the key issues, I think, that you and I have talked about is the media. And politicians have got to get their minds around what they're going to do about the media, because we know that Cameron had this problem with the Daily Mail and so on over Brexit and everything. We know that the media partly drives political debate, and that our politicians are very anxious about getting on the wrong side of the media and so on and so on. We cannot have a politics driven by the likes of the Daily Mail or even the Guardian for that matter. We need to have a politics which is able to be a coherent professional group that is coming together to make decisions about how to create a better society, a better world, and address some of the problems that we've got. And they have to be debates that we all have. I mean, one of the other key issues is, big issue is take money out of politics, find ways in which we can support political action without them being funded by interest groups. Recognizing that when you've got a system like ours, you always split the vote, the Liberal Party and the Labour Party always split the vote. And so you need proportional representation of some kind. I mean, these have all been things that have been visited before. They're not in any way new, but they're really important, because the way we have it at the moment, the vast majority of MPs are in Parliament with less than 40% of the vote of their constituents. Well, that can't be right. I mean, that simply can't be right. So we need to find a politics which does allow people to feel that they can engage, and so you are getting much more involvement from your voters.
Huge thanks to Professor Paul Gilbert. This podcast was brought to you by the think tank Compassion in Politics. Our podcasts are part of the Real Agenda Network and produced by Kitty Horlick. Next time, I'll be talking to Neil Lawson, who runs Compass, the organisation working to build an alliance across everyone who wants a sustainable and fair society. It's a fascinating conversation where he touches on so many issues, particularly the problem he faced when trying to persuade the Labour Party to form an alliance with like-minded politicians from other parties. I hope you'll join us. And we'd love to hear from you, so do get in touch with any comments or questions. You can find us at compassioninpolitics.com. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please do subscribe and tell your friends about us. We're available on all the main podcast providers. Just search for Compassion in Politics. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to being back with you again soon.